And he kind of like looked up at me. He looked up at me and he wasn't limp or nothing. No, when I picked him up, you know what I'm saying? He was still kind of squirmy, but he didn't have a full fight.
He was only 2 years old, too young to understand betrayal, but not too young to feel it. What happened to him wasn't just a tragedy. It was a failure on multiple levels. A failure to protect, a failure to intervene, and ultimately, a failure that cost him his life. When authorities arrived, the story they were told didn't line up with what they saw. The explanation was simple, too simple, but the questions kept piling up. Why had no one spoken up sooner? Why had so many red flags been ignored? This was more than a single moment of violence. It was the final chapter in a pattern that had been quietly unfolding for weeks. A little boy was caught in the middle of something he couldn't understand, and by the time the truth came out, it was far too late. And the person responsible? He didn't seem worried at all. Before we go any further, please note that today's case involves the passing of a child and circumstances that may be upsetting to some viewers. We will present the facts responsibly and avoid graphic content, but viewer discretion is still advised. If you're new here, welcome. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. This is a space for people who believe these stories matter, and to our current subscribers, supporters, and everyone who's liked, commented, or shared our videos, thank you. Your support doesn't just grow the channel, it helps bring attention to cases that deserve to be remembered. You're helping give a voice to those who no longer have one, and we're incredibly grateful you're here. Now, let's get back to the story of Aaden Batista. Aaden Batista was born on May 2, 2008 in Palm Bay, Florida. He was the only son of Whitney Flowers and Jeffrey Batista. Not long after his birth, Whitney and Jeffrey separated, but both remained active in their roles as parents. Their custody arrangement was informal yet stable. Aaden spent most of his weekdays with his mother and many weekends and evenings with his father and paternal grandparents. Those who knew Aaden described him as bright and observant, full of energy and eager to explore the world around him. His presence was memorable even at such a young age. He had routines, familiar places, and people who deeply cared for him. His father, Jeffrey, was known to be reliable and consistent. When Aaden stayed with him, there was structure, meal times, play, and quiet nights at home. His paternal grandparents also played a significant role. They helped with caregiving during the week and often provided support whenever Jeffrey needed it. On the other side of town, Whitney was managing the demands of full-time work in healthcare. Employed as a medical assistant or nurse, she was often required to work long hours, including late-night shifts. With limited outside help and no formal daycare in place, she began leaning more on those within her immediate circle for support. Initially, this included trusted friends and neighbors, but that changed in the final months of 2009 when Jason Padgett entered her life. Whitney and Jason met through mutual acquaintances. The relationship developed quickly. Within just a few weeks, Jason was spending more and more time at Whitney's apartment. By the end of the year, he had moved in. To outsiders, the decision appeared rushed, especially given Jason's background. But Whitney seemed determined to build something stable, something new, and Jason became part of that vision. Jason Padgett's past, however, raised immediate concerns. He had a long record of offenses stretching back several years. His background included incidents involving theft, confrontation with law enforcement, and prior arrests related to violence. At the time he moved in, he had only recently been released from custody. Despite this, he quickly became a central figure in Aaden's daily routine. With Whitney often away at work, Jason was left to care for Aaden for long stretches of time. What had once been a balanced custody arrangement slowly shifted. Aaden began spending fewer days with his grandparents and more time in Whitney's apartment, often under Jason's supervision. Family members on Jeffrey's side later expressed concern. They noticed a shift in how often they saw Aaden. Some said his behavior had changed. Others pointed to small moments, missed calls, canceled visits, unexplained delays. Jeffrey himself attempted to revise the informal custody agreement, but without a legal structure in place, there was little he could do. During this time, subtle but important changes were happening behind closed doors, and while no single incident raised alarm high enough to trigger a formal investigation, the pattern was clear in hindsight. The people who once formed Aaden's circle of support were now further away, and the man now closest to him, a man with a documented history of instability, was rarely questioned. By early 2010, the home environment around Aaden had changed significantly. The structure, stability, and oversight he once had were slipping away, and no one, not family, not friends, not neighbors, realized just how critical those missing safeguards would become. Jason Padgett was 28 years old when he became part of the household shared by Whitney Flowers and her young son. The relationship started in the final months of 2009. It progressed quickly. Within just 3 months of meeting, Jason moved into Whitney's apartment and almost overnight became a daily presence in her son's routine. For many, the pace of their relationship was concerning, but those closest to Whitney said she seemed eager for stability, someone who could share responsibilities, help around the home, and fill the gaps left by her demanding work schedule. What few outside the relationship fully understood at the time was the history Jason brought with him. His record was long and complex. Over the years, Jason had faced multiple legal issues. He had been arrested for robbery, had prior drug charges, and had been involved in a number of altercations that resulted in serious legal consequences. His encounters with law enforcement were not isolated or minor. He had been in and out of the system for much of his adult life. At the time he moved in with Whitney, Jason had only recently been released from incarceration. Yet there was no mechanism in place to prevent him from living in a home with a minor. No agency intervened. And with no formal custody arrangement filed with the court, no one reviewed or challenged the change in the household structure. Soon after his arrival, neighbors began to notice disturbances. Loud arguments from the unit became more frequent. Some said they overheard yelling late at night. Others described the energy around the apartment as increasingly tense. Despite these concerns, no formal complaints were submitted. There were no police calls, no welfare checks. Those closest to Whitney also noticed shifts in the home environment. Jason was spending more and more time alone in the apartment, often responsible for day-to-day supervision. Friends who visited the home later described him as impatient, withdrawn, and difficult to engage. One visitor said he avoided answering questions and grew visibly frustrated during casual conversations. A few neighbors and acquaintances recalled troubling moments. A maintenance worker remembered seeing Jason pacing outside with a child, clearly agitated. A family friend mentioned an instance where the toddler appeared unusually quiet during a short visit. Another neighbor shared that she once observed Jason handling the boy in a way that made her uncomfortable, but admitted she chose not to get involved. All of these accounts were shared after the fact, long after they could have made a difference. In every case, no report was made to local authorities or child services. Whether it was fear, hesitation, or uncertainty about what they were witnessing, the result was the same: silence. By early 2010, Jason Padgett had taken on a central role inside the home. He had full access to Whitney's apartment, control of daily routines, and consistent, unsupervised time with the minor. All without formal scrutiny. His criminal background remained buried in public files. His behavior, though noticed, was never documented in official records, and the people who saw signs didn't speak up, not until it was too late. In the weeks before April 7, 2010, something in the apartment on Waxwing Avenue began to shift. Subtle at first, then harder to ignore. People close to the situation later admitted that they had noticed things, moments that didn't feel right. But without context and without action, those observations faded into silence. Several residents of the apartment complex remembered hearing raised voices coming from inside. The volume and frequency were enough that neighbors recalled it without being asked. A janitor who maintained the building noticed something else. A brief interaction in the hallway, where he saw Jason Padgett with the young boy. When asked about marks around the child's eye, Padgett casually attributed them to a fall, calling him clumsy. A friend of Whitney's visited around the same time. She later described the home as tense. During her visit, she noticed the boy seemed distant. There were faint marks on his arm, and when she asked Jason what happened, his response was defensive. When she continued to question him, she was asked to leave. What's critical is that each of these accounts existed before April 7th. All of them were shared later, when it was already too late to intervene. On April 7th, Whitney left for her shift at the hospital at around 3 p.m. Jason remained in the apartment. According to his later statements, the boy had an accident in the bathroom while brushing his teeth. A fall, he said, but no one else was present to confirm the story. He didn't reach out to Whitney, he didn't alert anyone. Instead, he claimed he put the boy in bed, and for the next several hours, Padgett continued about his evening. He reportedly played video games, he texted friends. According to one recipient, he made no mention of anything unusual. No outside contact was made, no medical attention was sought. By the time Whitney returned home, nearly 8 hours had passed. Whitney arrived at the apartment around 11:15 p.m. The lights were dim. Jason told her the boy had gone to sleep early, but when she checked the bedroom, something felt off. Her son wasn't resting. He wasn't responding. She asked Jason what had happened. He repeated the same line. It wasn't serious, just a small fall. But something in his demeanor, she would later say, felt wrong. There was hesitation, there was avoidance. When she realized the situation required urgent care, Whitney acted. She transported her son to Holmes Regional Medical Center. Once there, medical professionals began their evaluations and quickly determined that additional resources were needed. He was transferred to Arnold Palmer Hospital in Orlando for further assessment. At the second facility, the clinical team began piecing together the boy's condition. Their findings raised immediate concern. The account of a minor accident didn't align with what they were seeing. As tests continued, the extent of the medical situation became clearer. On the morning of April 8th, the official status changed. The boy's condition had reached a critical point, and medical intervention could no longer reverse it. Aaden Batista passed away. Healthcare staff contacted law enforcement. A report was filed. An investigation was opened. For the first time, the version of events given to authorities would be placed under scrutiny. The story that had until then remained within the walls of a small apartment would soon be examined under the weight of expert analysis, witness accounts, and forensic review. The investigation was only beginning. The moment medical professionals at Arnold Palmer Hospital reviewed the full extent of Aaden's condition, a chain of internal red flags was triggered. The story they were given, that a young boy had slipped while brushing his teeth, didn't align with the medical profile in front of them. It was clear that the situation required immediate escalation. Hospital staff, following established procedures, referred the case to law enforcement. A forensic review was launched, and a board-certified pathologist was brought in to conduct a comprehensive examination. The findings from the forensic analysis added sharp contrast to the narrative Jason Padgett had given. The injuries observed were not typical of a short fall or isolated accident. Specialists noted patterns that suggested a more complex history. injuries that were varied in appearance and seemed to have occurred over multiple points in time. The report confirmed that several of the medical indicators showed inconsistencies with Padgett's version of events. What stood out even more was that some of the physical signs showed evidence of having existed prior to the day in question. This created a timeline that extended far beyond a single afternoon. The explanation offered, a slip in the bathroom, no longer held weight. The medical data provided a different view, one involving repeated incidents, not a one-time misstep. First responders who had been present during the transport also submitted their accounts. They noted Padgett's guarded demeanor, limited communication, and unusual responses during basic questioning. According to their logs, he appeared disconnected from the seriousness of the situation. In contrast, Whitney Flowers had been visibly shaken and overwhelmed, struggling to understand how her son had declined so rapidly. Detectives from the Palm Bay Police Department were assigned to the case immediately. Padgett was brought in for a formal interview the next day. Sitting across from investigators, he initially repeated the same version. The boy had simply fallen. He claimed it was minor, said he seemed fine afterward, and maintained that nothing out of the ordinary had taken place. But investigators had already reviewed the preliminary forensic results. They knew the account wasn't adding up. With each inconsistency, the pressure grew. Detectives methodically broke down the timeline, the gaps in his story, and the discrepancies between his claims and the medical documentation. Eventually, Padgett shifted his position. He admitted to becoming frustrated, describing a moment where he grabbed Aaden by the leg and let go. He said it wasn't intentional, that it was an emotional response, not something planned. But even this revised statement didn't resolve the conflict between what was being said and what had been medically confirmed. The revised version raised even more questions. Investigators challenged him repeatedly. One of the detectives, according to official transcripts, told him directly, "This wasn't from one fall, Jason. We've read the reports. We know that." What emerged in the interview was a pattern of avoidance, partial truths layered with deflection. But by then, the professionals handling the case had built a clear structure around what had taken place. The forensic team had already concluded that the explanation Padgett offered was inconsistent with the condition observed. Outside of the interview room, police had already begun gathering supplemental statements from hospital staff, neighbors, and individuals close to the family. The emerging portrait was consistent. There had been early signs, unspoken concerns, and growing doubts in the weeks leading up to the incident. Taken together, the medical findings, Padgett's conflicting accounts, and the lack of timely action, the case against him was forming. And now, with investigators closing in, attention was shifting toward the next step: formal charges, and a courtroom that would determine what accountability looked like in a case that had shaken an entire community. By mid-2010, the investigation into the events surrounding Aaden Batista had reached a decisive point. The medical evaluations were complete, the forensic evidence reviewed, and statements gathered. After months of building the case piece by piece, law enforcement proceeded with formal charges against Jason Padgett. He was taken into custody and charged with multiple felony counts, including first-degree homicide, endangerment, and criminal neglect. These charges reflected the serious nature of the case, not only in terms of what occurred on April 7th, but also the concerns raised about prior warning signs. Padgett remained in custody as pre-trial motions began. His defense team requested extensions and argued for additional evaluations, citing the complexity of the evidence. The official trial date was set for 2012. Inside the courtroom, the tone was measured but heavy. The case had drawn significant public interest. Community members, reporters, and legal observers filled the seats, eager to follow how the proceedings would unfold. The prosecution opened by outlining their core argument: that the evidence told a very different story from what Padgett had initially claimed. Key elements of the state's case included expert testimony from forensic and medical professionals, a timeline supported by hospital records, and witness statements describing prior concerns about Padgett's behavior. One by one, specialists explained why the injuries could not be explained by a minor household incident. Their conclusions pointed to a pattern, not a one-time occurrence. The jury also heard Jason Padgett's recorded interviews. Over time, his explanations had shifted. What began as a claim of an accidental fall had evolved into a more complicated admission that he had responded in frustration during a moment of tension. Prosecutors emphasized the sequence of these statements to show a lack of consistency and a pattern of avoidance rather than accountability. Neighbors and acquaintances also testified. Some described overhearing conflicts inside the apartment. Others recalled seeing unexplained marks or awkward interactions. One witness, the maintenance worker mentioned previously, stated that Padgett dismissed concerns when asked about visible injuries, offering vague explanations that didn't match the circumstances. The defense team focused on a different strategy. They suggested that Whitney Flowers bore partial responsibility, arguing that she had entrusted Padgett with responsibilities he wasn't prepared for. They described the event as a momentary lapse, attempting to frame it as unintentional and out of character. They painted Padgett as overwhelmed, not malicious. But the prosecution pressed back with hard data. They presented a detailed timeline of the day in question, including phone records, witness accounts, and hospital reports. They pointed out that Padgett had delayed seeking help, and that his actions following the incident raised serious questions about his intent and state of mind. The jury deliberated for several hours after closing arguments. In the end, the verdict was clear. Jason Padgett was found guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase followed shortly after. The judge imposed the maximum penalty allowed by law, life in prison with no possibility of parole. According to those present in the courtroom, Padgett remained mostly silent. He showed no visible reaction as the sentence was read aloud. The family sat together in the gallery, holding each other. Aaden's grandfather, who had been present at the hospital during the final hours, was seen emotional during the proceedings. Other family members quietly wept as the case drew to a close. For prosecutors, the conviction marked the end of a long, difficult investigation. For the family, it offered some measure of justice, though no verdict could ever fully restore what had been lost. The courtroom emptied slowly that day. Outside, reporters prepared statements. Community members spoke quietly among themselves. And as the door closed behind Jason Padgett, so too did one of the most closely watched cases in Brevard County's recent history. After the sentencing, attention shifted away from the courtroom and toward the institutions that were meant to provide oversight. Behind the headlines and verdicts, a more difficult truth began to surface. One that exposed missed chances and preventable errors. Records later revealed that Brevard County's Department of Children and Families had an active file linked to the household. Concerns had been flagged. A case had been opened, but no decisive action was taken. No in-home evaluation, no follow-up visit. The situation remained in a state of limbo until it was too late to intervene. Just days before the emergency response that changed everything, officers from a local police department had visited the residence. The visit was prompted by a 911 call. Jason Padgett provided an explanation at the scene, one that was accepted without further verification, and then the officers left. No official investigation followed. No alert was made to protective services. It was a moment where questions could have been asked and weren't. Outside the agencies, there were also individuals, people who had noticed things, neighbors, friends, visitors. Some had seen changes in the child's behavior. Others had overheard confrontations or witnessed interactions that didn't feel right. In later interviews, several of them admitted they had considered reporting their concerns, but in each case, that call was never made. The failure was not isolated to one agency or one decision. It stretched across multiple layers of oversight and inaction. The public response was swift. When the details became public, outrage followed. Advocacy groups demanded investigations. Journalists began digging deeper. Among the most impactful coverage was the Miami Herald's Innocence Lost series, an extensive examination of similar cases across the state. The series pointed to repeated patterns, delayed responses, unanswered reports, and oversight gaps that put vulnerable individuals at risk. This case quickly became a symbol not just for what happened inside one home, but for the cracks in a much larger structure. It prompted questions in state offices, courtroom hallways, and community forums. How did this go unnoticed? What could have been done differently? And how many other cases had followed a similar path? Despite public pressure, no charges were brought against Whitney Flowers. Prosecutors maintained that their evidence centered on Jason Padgett, whose actions and admissions were the basis for the criminal case. While there was criticism around the broader circumstances, no legal action was taken against Whitney. Officials cited insufficient evidence to support that she knowingly allowed harm to occur. The case closed in court, but outside the legal system, it left behind questions that still haven't been fully answered. It sparked legislative reviews and internal audits, but for those who lived through it, the reality remains: the warning signs were there. The systems meant to respond didn't, and a young life was lost in the silence. What unfolded in Palm Bay wasn't just the result of one person's actions. It was the result of inaction, from people who hesitated and systems that didn't respond. There were signals, there were opportunities, and there were moments when one call, one visit, one report might have changed the outcome. This case remains a stark reminder of what happens when accountability arrives too late. Thank you for watching. If this documentary brought new understanding or insight, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. You help keep these stories alive and ensure that voices like Aaden's are not forgotten. There are more cases that need to be told and more voices that deserve to be remembered. You can also check out the next video on the screen. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next video.